Hello students, welcome to our Read Aloud. Today we will enjoy one last story about George Washington. The House That George Built. Which house do you think the title is referring to? I see back here a big white house. Does that give you a clue? And on the back I see this must be George on his horse looking over things. There's a stack of bricks. And here is like a big hole in the ground. You know, they have to dig a big hole in the ground when they start a big building. So let's see. The House That George Built by Suzanne Slade, illustrated by Rebecca Bond. And here's the title page. Oh, and I see, I guess, George looking down at some plans for a very big white house. Does that remind you of a U.S. symbol we've learned about? Oh, and look, it's colonial times. So just like in Dear Mr. Washington, they write with ink from a pot and a quill or feather pen. Same stuff we see here on the table for George Washington. Okay, on the first page, I see George Washington looking at all these people, and this says forward. So a foreword is a very short story before the real story. And this is just explaining about the Revolution and how we ended up with a new country. So in this book, on one side, there's sometimes explanation, some more details about what's happening, and then there's like a little part on the other side. So let's see how this goes. George had many responsibilities as the first president. There were laws to pass, important people to meet, and an entire country to run. Although George was the busiest guy in the land, he wanted to create a home where future presidents would live. So George set out to build a special house that would be a symbol of this great new nation. This is the story of the president's house that George built. First, George looked for the perfect place to put this fine house. He searched the land and discovered a beautiful wooded hill in Maryland. On that hill, George found a lovely spot overlooking the sparkling Potomac River. This is the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Next, George needed a plan for the president's house. He held a contest and offered $500 or a gold medal to the person with the best design. When the entries started arriving, George got worried. Some drawings were too small and simple for this strong, growing nation. Others were too fussy and frilly for this hard-working new nation. Then George spied a magnificent drawing with majestic columns, grand staircases, and a stately oval room. James Hoban's design was just right, and he won the contest. This is the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Are you noticing something about the sound of this part of the book? Even though George held the most important job in America, he didn't think he was too important to lend a hand to the building project. George strapped on his boots and helped survey. Ooh, remember, he loved to survey, right? That's what he learned to do when he was young. And measure the construction site. Then he pounded in wood stakes to mark the exact location where the president's house would be built. A large hole was dug between the stakes and filled with stone, wood, and sand, creating a firm foundation for the president's house. This is the foundation that was dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Next, George needed bricks, lots of them. But how could he get thousands of heavy bricks up the steep hill? Fortunately, the mud beneath George's feet contained clay and sand, the perfect ingredients for making bricks. Soon, 2 kilns, those are ovens to dry the bricks, kilns were baking up red-hot bricks around the clock. Bricklayers used the fresh bricks to lay straight, sturdy walls. This is the brick that was baked strong and thick, that was laid on the foundation, that was dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Then George faced another problem. The nearby quarries didn't have enough stone to cover the outside of the president's house. He knew there was plenty of beautiful smooth stone in England, but he would never crawl back to the king. So George changed the house plan from 3 stories to 2, so it would need less stone. So a quarry is a place where out of the ground they can dig beautiful stone, or sometimes even rough stone to use for different projects. Stone workers carved flowers, leaves, and ribbons in the soft sandstone. Then the stone was painted with a thick sealer made of water, lime, salt, glue, and ground up rice, which turned the house white. This is the stone that was chiseled and honed, that went over the brick, that was baked strong and thick, that was laid on the foundation, that was dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. I wonder if I could say that all in one breath. Progress on the president's house was slow, but George wasn't discouraged. Carpenters built a wooden frame for the roof. They hammered sturdy timbers to support the inside walls. By now, over 100 workers, freemen and slaves, lived on the construction site in small temporary huts. They labored from sunrise to sunset 6 long days a week, busy with presidential duties, and the house, George, worked 7. This is the wood that was sturdy and good, that was nailed near the stone, that was chiseled and honed, that went over the brick, that was baked strong and thick, that was laid on the foundation, that was dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Before George knew it, 8 years had gone by. The president's house was nearly finished, and so was his time in office. During George's last year as president, building officials asked him to change the plans because the house was getting too expensive. George approved their request to use slate instead of lead for the roof, so the president's house was topped with slate rock. Unfortunately, this heavy roof leaked when it rained. Oh my goodness, leaking in the rain. Wow. This is the roof that was almost waterproof, that went over the wood that was sturdy and good, nailed near the stone that was chiseled and honed, that went over the brick that was baked strong and thick, that was laid on the foundation, dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. George's term as president ended in 1797. He moved back home to Virginia, where he spent time with his family until his death in 1799. Sadly, George didn't live to see the second president, John Adams, move into the president's house on November 1st, 1800. Although the house wasn't completely finished, the plaster walls were still wet and the winding staircase had only a few steps, John and his wife Abigail made it their home. This is the day that John came to stay under the roof that was almost waterproof, that went over the wood that was sturdy and good, that was nailed near the stone that was chiseled and honed, that went over the brick that was baked strong and thick, that was laid on the foundation, that was dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Many neighbors stopped by to welcome John and Abigail, but most really came to sneak a peek at their incredible home. And this is the house that George built. And do you know what we call that house, right? The White House, right? That's where the president lives. And what's cool on this last page, here's a modern photograph of the White House. And it talks about some of the changes that later presidents made. Things like some of them, originally it just had lights from lanterns or candles. So gas lights were installed in the 1840s. Other people planted trees. A tennis court was added in 1902. It didn't have a place for automobiles at first, right? So William Howard Taft added a garage in 1909. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, had a swimming pool added in the 1930s because he had some physical problems that were helped by swimming. And other presidents added things like bowling alleys and jogging tracks. And our last president before President Trump added a vegetable garden. The Obamas added a vegetable garden. So that's the house that George built. Hope you enjoyed our read aloud. Don't forget to keep washing your hands, cover your coughs and sneezes, do some reading, do some writing, help your family around the house, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.